On the night of December 30th, 1979, in a modest ranch house on High Point Drive in Goleta, California, Robert Offerman and Debra Manning were asleep. The temperature outside had dropped to the low 50s. A thick coastal fog rolled in from the Pacific, swallowing streetlights whole. Inside, they had no idea someone had been watching them for weeks. Someone who knew their routines, someone who had already been inside their home, unlocking windows, studying the layout, preparing. At approximately 3 o'clock a.m., a masked figure moved through their unlocked sliding glass door. He carried a .38 caliber revolver and a flashlight. He bound them with pre-cut ligatures. For the next 2 hours, he terrorized them. Then he executed them both with gunshots to the head. Robert Offerman, 44, was a respected osteopathic physician. Debra Manning, 35, was a licensed clinical psychologist. They had their entire lives ahead of them. By sunrise, both were dead. Their bodies discovered hours later by a concerned friend. The killer left behind semen, fingerprints, and a shoe print. Investigators had evidence. What they didn't have was a suspect. What they didn't know was that this same man had already raped more than 50 women across Northern California, that he had killed twice before, that he would kill 8 more times before vanishing completely. What they absolutely could not have imagined was that the killer was a police officer. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. wore a badge while he committed some of history's most sadistic crimes. He investigated burglaries by day and committed rapes by night. He was trained in evidence collection and used that training to avoid leaving clues. He understood police procedures and exploited every gap, every jurisdictional boundary, every limitation in forensic technology for 12 years. From 1974 to 1986, DeAngelo terrorized California in ways that defy comprehension. He committed at least 120 burglaries, 51 rapes, and 13 murders. He stalked families for weeks before striking. He bound men so tightly, their hands turned black while he raped their wives and girlfriends repeatedly. He murdered couples in their sleep, bludgeoning them with logs from their own fireplaces. Then, in 1986, after killing 18-year-old Janelle Cruz in Irvine, he stopped completely. For 32 years, he lived a quiet suburban life, raised 3 daughters, worked as a truck mechanic, and mowed his lawn, while victims spent decades looking over their shoulders, while families buried their dead and searched desperately for answers. DeAngelo barbecued in his backyard. This is not just a story about a serial killer and rapist. This is a story about how a predator hid in plain sight, wearing the uniform meant to protect people. About how jurisdictional boundaries and technological limitations allowed him to operate freely. About how law enforcement had his DNA for nearly 2 decades, but lacked the tools to identify him. This is about the 44-year investigation that finally brought him to justice through revolutionary DNA genealogy technology, and about the survivors who never stopped fighting for that justice. This is about the hundreds of lives Joseph James DeAngelo shattered, and the 3 simple words one victim finally got to say when facing him in court: "I am free." Before we begin, this is a comprehensive deep dive with details you haven't heard before. If you appreciate thoroughly researched, fact-based true crime that honors victims and doesn't sensationalize violence, hit subscribe now. Drop a comment if you're familiar with this case. I want to know what shocked you most about DeAngelo's double life as both cop and criminal. Now let's go back to November 8, 1945. When this story truly begins, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York. a small town in the Finger Lakes region where winter arrived early and stayed late. Bath had a population of about 6,000, built around a Veterans Administration hospital that employed much of the town. The war had ended 3 months earlier. America was celebrating victory, welcoming soldiers home, building the suburban dream. Joseph James DeAngelo, SR, was one of those soldiers. A sergeant in the United States Army, he had survived the war and returned to start a family with Kathleen K. Louise Degret. Their first child, Joseph Jr., arrived that November. The family would eventually grow to include 4 children. Joseph Jr., 2 daughters named Rebecca and Constance, and a son named John. But stability was not part of the DeAngelo family story. Joseph S.R.'s military career meant constant relocation. By the time young Joe was school age, the family had been stationed at a U.S. Air Force base in West Germany. It was there, according to a relative who spoke to investigators decades later, that something happened that may have marked Joseph Jr. for life. The relative reported that young Joe, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, witnessed the rape of his sister Constance by 2 airmen in a warehouse on the base. Whether this is true, whether it happened as described, or whether DeAngelo actually witnessed it remains unclear. The information came from family members after his arrest, when everyone was searching for explanations for the inexplicable. But Rebecca DeAngelo, his other sister, would later state that their father was abusive, that Joe grew up in a household marked by violence and anger. What is certain is that the DeAngelo family was fractured in ways that went beyond normal military relocations. By the late 1950s, when Joseph Jr. was approaching his teenage years, the family had moved again, this time to Rancho Cordova, California, a suburb east of Sacramento. The area was experiencing explosive growth. New subdivisions were sprouting across former farmland and abandoned grape vineyards. Cheap tract homes with mortgaged furniture attracted working-class families. Joseph S.R. purchased one of these small houses where even the children's bunk beds and the radio were financed. Then Joseph S.R. essentially disappeared from the family. Military records show he was transferred to Korea, then to Florida. His wife Kay and the 4 children stayed behind in Rancho Cordova. Kay took a job as a waitress at Denny's to support the family. According to childhood friends, Joe's father was simply absent. The man of the house, by default, became young Joe. He cooked meals for his siblings. He washed their clothes. He made sure they got to school. His mother was working long hours, and when she wasn't working, she was seeing another man, a traveling welder, who had his own wife and children in Southern California. Neighbors and friends reported epic shouting matches between Joe and his mother. The household was chaos. Joe attended Mills Junior High School in Rancho Cordova beginning in 1959. The area was still half wild. Abandoned grape vineyards provided endless places for boys to roam unsupervised. Canals and creeks cut through the landscape. It was the kind of place where kids jumped fences, egged frogs, shot rabbits, and largely raised themselves. In 1961, Joe enrolled at Folsom High School, a few miles north. He played on the junior varsity baseball team, but was not particularly athletic or popular. Classmates would later describe him as someone trying hard to fit in, someone who wanted to be part of the group, but remained on the periphery. He had few close friends. His grades were mediocre. In 1964, he received a GED certificate rather than a traditional diploma. But even then, darkness lurked beneath the surface. Decades later, when prosecutors built their case, they would reveal that DeAngelo committed burglaries during his teenage years. He stole mail, According to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office, he tortured and killed animals. These are classic warning signs. The behavioral precursors that criminal psychologists call the McDonald triad, childhood predictors of violent behavior in adulthood. Yet to his peers, Joe seemed relatively normal. Stocky, dough-faced, he had an odd jounce to his gait that people noticed. He wore jeans, t-shirts, and suede ankle boots. He tried hard to project toughness, a James Dean badness. He laughed easily and draped his thick arms around people he'd just met. What Joe truly craved was belonging, family. He found it with a neighborhood family whose children attended Folsom High with him. He started coming around as a friend to the boys in the family. But soon he was calling the parents Mom and Pop. They treated him like their 10th child. Even put his class picture on the shelf next to their own kids. Joe spent more time at their house than his own. He ate meals there, participated in family discussions, and became especially close to the eldest sister, who became the closest thing he had to a confidant years later. This family would be shocked to learn what Joe had become. One of the daughters, Judy, would realize with horror that the hooded face she saw at her window one night during the East Area Rapist attacks, the face that paralyzed her with fear, had likely been Joe's. In September 1964, at age 18, DeAngelo made a decision that would shape the next phase of his life. He quit high school his senior year and enlisted in the United States Navy. He wanted to fly planes. The Navy had other ideas. They put him in the galley, then below deck as a damage controlman, essentially a mechanic. It was unglamorous work, the kind that kept you in the bowels of a ship while others saw action. But it gave DeAngelo structure, discipline, a clear hierarchy, and a defined role. He served for 22 months during the Vietnam War, stationed aboard the cruiser USS Canberra and the destroyer tender USS Piedmont. Both ships shelled Viet Cong strongholds from safe distances offshore. DeAngelo never saw the jungle combat he would later describe to others. He never led a four-man boat through rivers with machine guns blazing, but he told people he did. In one story he repeated throughout his life, DeAngelo claimed he'd lost part of a fingertip to enemy fire during a river patrol in the Mekong Delta. Stray bullets, he explained coolly. It made him seem hardened. A combat veteran who'd seen real action. The truth was far less dramatic. A family friend later revealed that Joe had simply gotten his hand caught when a rolling drum below deck sliced off the fingertip. The pattern of embellishment, of crafting a more impressive version of himself, was already forming. DeAngelo received an honorable discharge and spent another year in the Naval Reserve before returning to California in 1968. His mother had by then married the traveling welder, and Joe moved in with them in the hills outside Auburn, a small town northeast of Sacramento. At 23, DeAngelo was adrift. He enrolled at Sierra College in Rockland in August 1968, pursuing an associate degree in police science. The program attracted men like him, working class, not particularly intellectual, looking for stable careers with authority. Law enforcement offered respect, a uniform, and power. It was at Sierra College that DeAngelo met the woman who may have shaped his entire criminal trajectory. Bonnie Jean Colwell was 18 years old, 5 years younger than Joe, and everything he wasn't. She was bright, an honors student with her heart set on medical school. She worked as a lab assistant in the science department, caring for rats, rattlesnakes, and orphaned birds. One spring day in 1970, she brought a young great horned owl and a starling to the gravel commons to practice flying them. DeAngelo saw her from across the open space and made a beeline. Within days, he was showing up at the science lab where Bonnie worked, inserting himself into conversations. By the end of the first week, he asked her out. She said yes to this older man, this Vietnam veteran with swagger and muscle cars and stories about the war, to Bonnie, who came from a sheltered home where her father enforced strict rules about dating. Joe represented freedom, adventure. He taught her to ride on the back of his Honda motorcycle, her nose buried in the smell of English leather cologne. He handed her a Browning .22 rifle and took her dove hunting. He pushed her to take risks, to jump fences onto defense contractors' property, to spear frogs illegally, to shoot vultures out of the sky for no reason. Bonnie's father, Stan Colwell, was a World War II hero and high school principal with rigid ideas about men, women, and their roles. He didn't approve of an older man dating his teenage daughter. But when he learned Joe had served in Vietnam, he warmed to him. Soon Joe was integrated into the Colwell family, joining them at their farmhouse, bringing his stepfather St. Bernard, fixing broken toys for Bonnie's younger siblings. 2 months after they started dating, Joe gave Bonnie an engagement ring. She doesn't even recall a formal proposal. The ring, a large half-carat diamond set impractically high on a thin white gold band, was Joe's way of staking a claim. He told Bonnie he'd brought the diamond back from Vietnam, though it would have been outside the budget of any college student doing welding jobs and moonlighting as a commercial diver. Bonnie accepted the ring, but she was troubled by it. Joe had chosen the setting without consulting her, and it snagged on everything. She turned it around on her finger so the diamond pressed into her palm when she pulled on latex gloves at work. There was no consultation about what Bonnie wanted, just decisions made for her. The relationship revealed Joe's need for control. He was insatiable sexually, as Bonnie would later describe to prosecutors. Sex sessions lasted 3 hours, with Joe breaking away just as he climaxed, then returning minutes later to resume. He repeated the pattern 4 or 5 times. Bonnie found it exhausting and painful, but Joe seemed oblivious to her discomfort. He boasted that he'd trained himself to have mastery over his body. Decades later, investigators would recognize this pattern as disturbingly similar to the East Area Rapist's behavior. Joe's controlling nature extended beyond sex. He made decisions without her input. He courted risk and thrill speeding on his motorcycle, poaching game, trespassing on private property. He enjoyed instilling fear. Once, while riding his motorcycle with Bonnie clinging behind him, he suddenly veered off the road and plummeted down a steep slope. Only slowly did Bonnie realize it wasn't a crush Joe had deliberately taken an off-road trail to terrify her. He repeated the stunt whenever they passed the spot, delighting in her fear. Another time, when a German shepherd chased their motorcycle, Joe kicked out and snapped the dog's neck with a single blow. The dog crumpled dead on the pavement. Bonnie was beginning to see Joe as someone who believed himself above the rules, someone who enjoyed breaking laws and seeing others afraid, yet she stayed, committed before she fully understood what she'd committed to. Joe transferred to Sacramento State University in 1971, pursuing a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. It was there, in the spring of that year, that the relationship reached its breaking point. Joe was failing abnormal psychology, a class he needed to graduate. He demanded that Bonnie help him cheat on the final exam. Bonnie, the daughter of school teachers, refused. Joe became obsessed with the issue, bringing it up in every conversation, his voice dropping lower as he grew more insistent. Finally, Bonnie called him to her father's house and ended the engagement. She gave back the ring with the high solitary diamond. Joe left the Colwell house visibly upset as he walked to his car. He hurled the diamond ring into the tall grass behind the house. Bonnie searched for it with her siblings and friends, but found nothing. They concluded Joe must have faked the throw days later. Bonnie saw him in psychology class, holding hands with another girl. Some heartbreak, she thought. But Joe wasn't finished. Late one night soon after, Bonnie woke to tapping on her bedroom window. She pulled aside the drape to find a handgun inches from her face. Behind it was DeAngelo. "Get dressed," he ordered. "We're going to Reno." Bonnie ran to her parents' room, screaming that Joe was outside with a gun, demanding she marry him. Her father told her to lock herself in the bathroom and wait for nearly 2 hours. Bonnie shivered with fear while Stan Colwell talked Joe down in the darkness outside. When her father finally returned, he said only, "You can go back to bed." Joe's left. They never spoke of the incident again. Bonnie was so frightened, she dropped out of school for a semester and changed her majors when she returned. In 1972, she married a young accountant. But Joe didn't stay away within a few years. He'd purchased a house less than 2 miles from the couple. The incident at Bonnie's window revealed something crucial about DeAngelo's psychology. When faced with rejection, with loss of control, he responded with threats and weapons. He weaponized fear. And when he couldn't have what he wanted through normal means, he took it by force. This moment may have been the turning point, the crystallization of violent impulses that had been building throughout his life. The rejection by Bonnie, combined with his chaotic childhood, his need for control, his enjoyment of fear in others, and his belief that he was above rules, all of these elements were coalescing into something dangerous. But instead of spiraling immediately into violence, DeAngelo channeled his impulses into a career that would give him authority, respect, and access. In 1973, he completed his bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Sacramento State University with honors. He then took postgraduate courses and police training at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia, a city in California's Central Valley. He completed a 32-week police internship at the Roseville Police Department. In May 1973, DeAngelo was hired as a police officer in Exeter, a small town of about 10,000 people near Visalia. He was assigned to the burglary unit. The irony was profound. Joseph James DeAngelo, who had committed burglaries throughout his teenage years, who had tortured and killed animals, who had held a gun to his ex-fiancée's face, was now wearing a badge and investigating property crimes. He was 27 years old. He wore the uniform well. Colleagues found him competent. If unremarkable, he did his job, filed his reports, and blended in. But at night, something else was happening. In March 1974, while DeAngelo was working as a police officer in Exeter, a strange series of burglaries began in nearby Visalia. The Visalia Ransacker, as he would come to be known, struck more than 120 homes over the next 20 months. These were not ordinary burglaries. The ransacker often ignored cash and valuables left in plain sight, instead rifling through drawers, scattering women's underclothes, and stealing low-value items like piggy banks, foreign coins, and single earrings. He arranged items in bizarre displays. He scattered blue chip stamps across floors. He moved window screens onto beds, most disturbing. He was a hot prowl. Burglar, he entered homes while people were inside sleeping. Residents would wake to find someone had been in their bedroom, had touched them, had stood watching. When confronted, the intruder would flee with supernatural agility, vaulting fences and disappearing into the night. On November 30th, 1974, the ransacker hit 12 separate homes in a single night, police established patterns. The burglar climbed fences and moved through established routes, parks, walkways, ditches, trails. He attempted to pry open multiple entry points, particularly windows. He left multiple escape routes open. He placed warning items like dishes or bottles against doors, so he'd hear if someone approached. He wore gloves, leaving no fingerprints. This was not random. This was methodical. This was someone with training. Someone who understood how police investigated burglaries. Investigators later believed, based on timing and methodology, that the Visalia Ransacker was Joseph James DeAngelo. He lived 40 miles away in Exeter. He worked as a cop during the day. At night, he could practice his craft. He was honing his skills, learning how to enter homes undetected, studying how people slept, how they reacted to danger, discovering what it felt like to have complete power over people in their most vulnerable state. The burglaries were escalating in another way. Residents reported seeing a man without pants standing at windows. Others woke to someone touching them, running when they screamed. The ransacker was becoming sexually aggressive, and he was killing dogs. Family pets that barked or confronted him were found bludgeoned to death. He beat them with logs, the same method he would later use on human victims. It was methodical violence, a way to eliminate obstacles and send messages. On February 5, 1975, Claude Snelling, a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, chased a prowler discovered under his 16-year-old daughter's bedroom window around 10 o'clock p.m. The intruder escaped. 6 months later, on September 11, 1975, the intruder returned. At 2 o'clock a.m., Professor Snelling woke to strange noises. He ran through the open back door and found a ski-masked man in his carport, attempting to kidnap his daughter. The man had subdued her with threats of being stabbed or shot. Snelling confronted the intruder. The masked man shot him twice. Snelling staggered back into the house to his wife and died soon after. The killer punched and kicked the daughter, leaving her on the ground, then fled on a stolen bicycle. For the first time, the Visalia Ransacker had killed. 3 months later, on December 12, 1975, the ransacker made a mistake. Detective William McGowan was on stackout inside a garage near where the ransacker had been prowling. Around 8:30 p.m., a masked man entered the backyard. When McGowan attempted to detain him, the man shrieked, removed his mask, and feigned surrender. Then he jumped the fence, pulled out a revolver with his left hand, and fired at McGowan's face, shattering his flashlight. Nearby officers rushed to help, and the shooter escaped. Items left behind included blue chip stamps and a sock full of coins, the ransacker's calling cards. The Visalia ransackings stopped abruptly after that night in August 1976. DeAngelo left the Exeter Police Department and transferred to the Auburn Police Department, about 200 miles north in the Sacramento area. He'd been promoted. He was now a patrol officer in Auburn, working the night shift within months of his arrival. A new series of crimes began in the suburbs east of Sacramento. This time, the perpetrator wasn't just burglarizing homes and scattering underwear. He was raping women. By the time Joseph James DeAngelo arrived in Auburn in August 1976, he was no longer practicing. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would consume Northern California. The crimes that would make Joseph James DeAngelo one of America's most prolific serial killers began in earnest. On June 18, 1976, in Rancho Cordova, California, the same suburb where DeAngelo had grown up, at 4 o'clock a.m., a masked man wearing a ski mask broke into a home and raped a woman at knife point. She was the first known victim of what authorities would call the East Area Rapist. DeAngelo was still working as a police officer in Exeter at the time. 170 miles south of Rancho Cordova was home territory. He knew every street, every canal, every escape route. It was where he'd spent his teenage years, jumping fences and roaming unsupervised through abandoned vineyards. 1 month later, on July 19, 1976, he struck again in nearby Carmichael. Then in August in Rancho Cordova, then September in Carmichael. The attacks were accelerating. By the end of 1976, there had been 10 rapes in the Sacramento area, all following an identical pattern. In August 1976, right in the middle of this rape series, DeAngelo transferred from the Exeter Police Department to the Auburn Police Department. Auburn was just 30 miles northeast of Sacramento, a perfect staging ground for his attacks on the eastern suburbs. He now had the ideal cover. He worked as a patrol officer on the night shift in Auburn. His colleagues thought he was working. His wife he'd married, Sharon Marie Huddle, in November 1973, thought he was working. But instead of patrolling Auburn, DeAngelo was driving south to Sacramento, selecting victims and committing rapes. His methodology was sophisticated, the product of his Visalia apprenticeship and his law enforcement training. He conducted extensive reconnaissance on targeted neighborhoods. He would prowl for weeks before attacking, looking into windows, studying routines, identifying single women or couples. Residents frequently reported prowlers in the weeks before attacks. Many homes experienced break-ins where nothing was taken. DeAngelo was entering to unlock windows, disable weapons, and plant ligatures for later use. He called victims on the phone, sometimes for months before attacking. He learned their schedules, their habits, whether they lived alone. The calls were often silent, just breathing, a psychological torture that left women constantly on edge. He struck in middle-class neighborhoods near schools, creeks, trails, or open spaces that provided quick escape routes. He was athletic, despite his stocky build, capable of vaulting 6-foot fences with ease. Witnesses who spotted him during his escapes were astonished at his agility. When he attacked, he came prepared. He wore a ski mask and gloves. He carried a flashlight and a knife or gun. He brought pre-cut ligature shoelaces, often or used ligatures he'd planted during earlier break-ins. He knew to avoid leaving fingerprints. He understood evidence collection because he collected evidence for a living. DeAngelo's initial targets were women alone in single-story homes. He would break in through a window or sliding glass door, awaken the victim with a flashlight in her face, and threaten her with a knife or gun. He bound her hands and feet so tightly that victims' extremities went numb for hours after being freed. He blindfolded and gagged her with torn towels or clothing. Then he raped her, often multiple times over several hours. But media coverage of the East Area Rapist noted that he only attacked women alone. So DeAngelo changed his methodology. He began targeting couples. This change demonstrated his adaptability, his attention to media reports, and his escalating confidence. Attacking couples was more dangerous, but DeAngelo had a system. He would break in while the couple slept, shine his flashlight on them, and threaten them with a gun. He forced the woman to tie up the man, then he would retie the man's bonds even tighter, often cinching the ligatures until the man's hands and feet turned purple or black from lack of circulation. DeAngelo would then stack dishes or bottles on the man's back and tell him, "If I hear those dishes rattle, I'll kill everyone in the house. I'll bring you your wife's ears." He would separate the couple, taking the woman to another room, where he raped her repeatedly while the bound man lay in agony, listening to his wife or girlfriend being assaulted, terrified that any movement would result in murder if there were children in the home. DeAngelo locked them in bathrooms or tied them to beds. He threatened to kill them if anyone made noise. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical assault. After the rapes, DeAngelo often spent hours ransacking the home. He ate food from the refrigerator. He drank beer. He rummaged through closets and drawers. Sometimes he raped the victim again. He would suddenly reappear after victims thought he'd left, jumping from the darkness to terrorize them further. His stamina was inhuman. Victims reported that he could achieve climax, disengage, wait a few minutes, then rape them again. He repeated this pattern 4 or 5 times during attacks that lasted 3 hours or more. It was the same pattern he'd displayed with Bonnie Colwell years earlier. He had trained himself to have this endurance. And he talked. He had a distinctive voice. High-pitched and whispering, he stuttered. He made threats. "I'll kill you. I'll cut off your ear. I'm going to kill everyone." He asked strange questions. "Who lives here? Where's your money? I need money for my van." Sometimes the questions seemed designed to confuse investigators' references to a van he didn't have. Needing money when he ignored cash lying in plain sight. Most chilling, he sometimes whispered to himself. Victims heard him muttering in other rooms, as if he were having conversations with voices only he could hear. The East Area Rapist was not just committing crimes. He was tormenting entire communities. He called victims after the attacks, breathing into the phone or saying, "Remember when we played?" He called police with taunting messages. He called women he hadn't yet attacked, whispering threats, laying psychological groundwork. By the end of 1977, DeAngelo had committed at least 23 rapes in the Sacramento area. Law enforcement was in chaos. The crimes were so prolific, so methodical, that they overwhelmed local police departments. Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, Sacramento Police, and multiple small-town agencies were all investigating related attacks, but sharing information poorly. Task forces formed, community meetings were held. Women in East Sacramento, Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and Rancho Cordova lived in terror. They bought dogs. They installed alarms. They slept with weapons. It didn't matter. The East Area Rapist kept coming, and all the while, Joseph James DeAngelo was wearing a police uniform in Auburn, investigating burglaries, attending community events. Living with his wife in Citrus Heights, Joseph James DeAngelo's attack methodology was unlike anything Sacramento law enforcement had encountered. It combined police training, athletic ability, and psychological sadism into a terrifyingly effective system. Phase 1. Surveillance. Weeks before any attack, DeAngelo prowled target neighborhoods at night. He peered into windows, studying routines, noting which homes had dogs, which had alarms, which had single women or couples. Residents frequently reported prowlers in the weeks preceding attacks. A masked figure glimpsed in backyards, footprints in flower beds, the sense of being watched. He preferred homes near creeks, trails, or open fields that provided quick escape routes. He was athletic despite his stocky build, capable of vaulting 6-foot fences with ease. Phase 2. Pre-attack break-ins. DeAngelo would enter homes while residents were away, not to steal, but to prepare. He unlocked windows for later entry. He located weapons and unloaded them or hid them. He placed ligatures pre-cut lengths of shoelace in strategic locations throughout the house. He memorized floor plans and identified escape routes. By the time he returned for the actual attack, he knew the home better than its occupants did. Phase 3. The attack. Entry came through an unlocked window or sliding door, typically between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m. Though he sometimes struck as early as 6 o'clock p.m. A flashlight in the victim's face, knife or gun pressed to her throat, whispered threats delivered in a distinctive high-pitched voice. Do what I say, or I'll kill you. For women alone. He bound them immediately with ligatures so tight that hands and feet went numb within minutes. Blindfold and gag fashioned from torn towels or clothing, and hours of sexual assault, interrupted by periods where DeAngelo would leave the room eating food from the refrigerator, drinking beer, ransacking drawers, only to return and assault the victim again. For couples, the methodology was more elaborate. He forced the woman to tie up the man, then retied the bindings himself, cinching them until circulation stopped and extremities turned purple or black. He stacked dishes or bottles on the bound man's back and delivered his signature threat. If I hear those dishes rattle, I'll kill everyone in the house. Then he would take the woman to another room and rape her repeatedly while her husband or boyfriend lay bound and helpless, listening to her cries, terrified that any movement would result in her murder. The psychological torture inflicted on male victims was deliberate. DeAngelo wanted them to feel powerless, emasculated, complicit in their inability to protect their partners. Phase 4. Post-attack terror. When he finally left often, after 3 or 4 hours, he wasn't truly gone. Victims would think he'd departed, begin to relax, and then he would suddenly reappear, jumping from the darkness for one more assault. After attacks, DeAngelo called victims, sometimes immediately, sometimes weeks later, heavy breathing, whispered reminders. Remember when we played? Pure psychological terrorism, ensuring victims never felt safe even after the physical assault ended. The evolution, media coverage inadvertently helped him adapt. When news reports noted the East Area Rapist only attacked women alone, DeAngelo immediately began attacking couples. When newspapers described his entry methods, he varied them. He was reading his own press coverage and adjusting accordingly. Between June 1976 and July 1979, this methodology produced at least 51 rapes across 6 Northern California counties: Sacramento, Contra Costa, Stanislaus, San Joaquin, Alameda, and Yolo. DeAngelo was not merely a sexual predator. He was a terrorist who had systemized fear itself. The attacks begin, his 10th victim. Attacked on December 18, 1976, was 15-year-old Chris Pedretti. She was home alone while her parents attended a Christmas party. At 6 o'clock p.m., as Chris played the piano, DeAngelo entered wearing a ski mask, put a knife to her throat, and said the words that would later become the title of Michelle McNamara's book about the case. Do what I say, or I'll kill you and be gone in the dark. For more than 2 hours. He raped Chris 3 times. He alternated between leaving her outside, naked in the December cold, and bringing her back inside to different rooms where he assaulted her again. Finally, he left her blindfolded, bound, and gagged on a couch in front of a fireplace. Chris freed herself and called neighbors for help. When police arrived and administered a rape kit, asking intimate questions she wasn't equipped to answer as a 15-year-old, Chris experienced what she later described as a second and third victimization. In 1977, the attacks continued and expanded geographically. DeAngelo committed at least 13 more rapes in Sacramento County, but now he was also striking in Stockton, San Joaquin County, and other areas farther from his Auburn base. His reconnaissance was extensive. Neighbors reported prowlers for weeks before attacks. Windows were pried open, then closed again. Nothing taken. Phone calls came at odd hours, silent or with heavy breathing. DeAngelo was studying his victims, learning their schedules, ensuring they fit his preferred profile. He preferred homes near creeks, trails, or open fields, places where he could approach and escape without being seen on streets. He avoided homes with large dogs, but sometimes killed smaller dogs that posed obstacles. Several victims reported that their family pets had been found bludgeoned to death shortly before their attacks. Though not all of these killings were definitively linked to DeAngelo, in June 1977, the East Area Rapist began making disturbing phone calls to police and media. A call to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department featured a man saying, "I am the East Side Rapist," followed by heavy breathing and hang up. Other calls taunted investigators, suggesting they were incompetent, that he was smarter than them. By late 1977, the community was in full panic. Town hall meetings drew hundreds of terrified residents. The Sacramento Bee ran extensive coverage. Television stations provided safety tips. Women formed neighborhood watch groups. Hardware stores sold out of locks and alarms. None of it stopped him. DeAngelo simply adjusted. When neighborhoods became too alert, he moved to new areas. In October 1977, he attacked in Davis, a college town west of Sacramento. In November, he moved to the affluent neighborhood of La Riviera. In December, he struck in San Ramon. Across the county line in Contra Costa County, he was expanding his territory, demonstrating his willingness to drive long distances to find victims. Investigators later realized he often chose neighborhoods he could access via Highway 50 or Interstate 80, major routes he could use for quick escapes. The attacks in 1978 revealed more of DeAngelo's depravity. On January 28, 1978, he attacked a woman in Sacramento. During the rape, he suddenly broke down and began sobbing on her pillow. "I hate you, Bonnie," he cried. "I hate you, I hate you. I hate you." The victim reported this to police, who had no idea who Bonnie was or what significance the name held. 40 years later, investigators would identify Bonnie Colwell, DeAngelo's ex-fiancée, as the likely source of his rage. The attacks continued through 1978 and into 1979. By June 1979, DeAngelo had committed at least 51 rapes across 6 northern California counties: Sacramento, Contra Costa, Stanislaus, San Joaquin, Alameda, and Yolo. In addition, he'd committed over 120 burglaries, killed multiple dogs, and caused immeasurable psychological trauma to hundreds of residents who lived in fear. But on July 5, 1979, everything changed for Joseph James DeAngelo. He was caught shoplifting. An employee at a Save Mart store in Auburn observed DeAngelo, in full police uniform, steal a can of dog repellent and a hammer. The employee reported it to the store manager, who called the Auburn Police Department. DeAngelo was arrested by his own colleagues. It was a trivial crime, items worth less than $10. But for a police officer, it was career-ending. DeAngelo was charged with shoplifting, placed on 6 months probation, and fired from the Auburn Police Department in October 1979. According to multiple sources, DeAngelo reacted to his firing with rage. He threatened to kill the chief of police. He allegedly stalked the chief's house. His career was over. His identity as a law enforcement officer, the source of his authority, and his cover for his crimes was gone. The East Area Rapist attacks stopped in July 1979, right around the time of DeAngelo's shoplifting arrest. Northern California residents breathed a sigh of relief. Had the attacker been caught for something else? Had he moved away? Had he died? No one knew, but the rape stopped. What investigators didn't know was that DeAngelo hadn't stopped. He'd simply moved south and escalated from rape to murder. Unlike many organized crime stories, Joseph James DeAngelo did not benefit from widespread corruption in law enforcement. His success came not from corrupt cops protecting him, but from systemic failures in law enforcement coordination, technology limitations, and his own insider knowledge. The Sacramento area law enforcement agencies failed to coordinate effectively. The Sheriff's Department, Sacramento Police, and multiple small-town police departments all investigated related attacks, but shared information poorly. Jurisdictional boundaries meant that patterns visible across the region were invisible to individual departments. DeAngelo exploited these gaps ruthlessly. He attacked in different jurisdictions deliberately, knowing that each agency maintained separate case files, separate suspect lists, separate investigation strategies. Additionally, DeAngelo worked as a cop in Auburn while committing crimes in Sacramento. His colleagues never suspected him. When he called in sick or left his patrol area, no one questioned where he'd actually been. His uniform gave him legitimacy, access, and trust. The corruption, such as it was a corruption of systems rather than individuals, law enforcement structure that allowed a predator in uniform to operate freely. When the East Area Rapist vanished from Northern California in July 1979, Southern California had no idea what was coming. On December 30th, 1979, in Goleta, a coastal town near Santa Barbara, Dr. Robert Offerman, 44, and psychologist Debra Manning, 35, were shot to death in Offerman's home on High Point Drive. Both were bound with ligatures before being executed with a .38 caliber revolver. The killer had entered through an unlocked sliding glass door, attacked them in their bedroom, and left behind semen evidence. The crime bore some similarities to the East Area Rapist attacks: ligatures, nighttime home invasion, meticulous planning, but investigators in Santa Barbara had no reason to connect it to crimes 300 miles north. DNA analysis didn't exist yet. The East Area Rapist case files were scattered across Northern California agencies. There was no centralized database. DeAngelo had moved to Southern California with his wife Sharon after his termination from Auburn Police. They purchased a second home in Long Beach. Sharon was now a successful divorce attorney. They were raising 3 daughters to neighbors and family. Joe seemed like a regular guy, a bit odd, prone to angry outbursts and profane tirades, but nothing that suggested serial murder. On March 13, 1980, in Ventura, Lyman Smith, 43, and his wife Charlene Smith, 33, were brutally murdered in their home. Lyman was a successful lawyer. Charlene was an interior decorator. The killer had entered their home, bound them, then bludgeoned them both to death with a log from their fireplace. Charlene had been raped. The weapon, a fireplace log, was significant. It was the same method DeAngelo had used to kill dogs during his Visalia Ransacker phase and his early burglaries. On August 19, 1980, Patrice Harrington, 27, and Keith Harrington, 24, were murdered in their home in Dana Point. They'd been married just 3 months. Both were bludgeoned to death. Patrice had been raped. The killer had entered through an unlocked door, attacked them while they slept, bound them, and beat them with overwhelming force. The violence was escalating. DeAngelo was no longer content with rape. He was killing efficiently, brutally, and without apparent remorse. On February 5, 1981, Manuela Within, 28, was home alone in Irvine when DeAngelo broke in. Her husband David was in the hospital. Manuela was raped and beaten to death. She fought desperately. Evidence at the scene showed she'd struggled, but DeAngelo overpowered her. He left her body in the bedroom and fled on July 27, 1981. Sherry Domingo, 35, and Gregory Sanchez, 27, were attacked in Sherry's home in Goleta. They'd been dating for several months. Gregory was beaten so severely with a blunt instrument that he suffered massive brain hemorrhaging and died from the trauma. Sherry was raped and also beaten to death. Both were found by Sherry's teenage son when he returned home the next day. The Southern California murders shared common elements with each other and with the earlier East Area Rapist attacks. Nighttime home invasions, ligatures, meticulous planning, rape followed by murder, attacks on couples, use of blunt force instruments, knowledge of when victims would be alone or vulnerable. But investigators in Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange County, and Los Angeles had no idea they were looking for the same person. The crimes occurred in different jurisdictions. Without DNA databases or centralized information systems, the connections remained invisible. Southern California media dubbed the killer the original Night Stalker, not knowing he'd been operating as the East Area Rapist for years. This was different from Richard Ramirez, who would later become known as the Night Stalker in Los Angeles. The attacks were sporadic now, separated by months instead of weeks. DeAngelo was older 35 in 1980, and he had family responsibilities. His 3 daughters were growing up. His wife's legal career demanded attention. He couldn't prowl nightly as he had during his police days. But when he did attack, he was methodical and devastating. On May 4, 1986, the original Night Stalker struck for the final time. Janelle Cruz was 18 years old, living with a family in Irvine. She was home alone on the night of May 4th, while her family was out. When they returned, they found Janelle dead in her bedroom, raped and beaten with a pipe wrench taken from the garage. Janelle was the youngest and the last known victim of Joseph James DeAngelo. She'd been 3 years old when he committed his first known rape in 1976. She'd grown up during his decade of terror, and she died at his hands just weeks before graduating high school. After Janelle's murder, the original Night Stalker vanished completely. No more attacks, no more murders, no more taunting phone calls for 32 years. Investigators would search for him. Families would grieve. Survivors would live with trauma. Communities would remember the fear, and Joseph James DeAngelo would go to work at a Save Mark distribution center, mow his lawn, and live as if nothing had happened. Joseph James DeAngelo had no rivals in the traditional sense. He was a lone operator, not part of any criminal organization. There were no turf wars, no conflicts with other criminals, no territory disputes. His rivals were the police agencies trying to catch him, and he was always several steps ahead. The following victims represent those Joseph James DeAngelo was convicted of murdering. Each deserves to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Claude Snelling, on a warm February evening in 1975. Claude Snelling stood in his backyard in Visalia and watched a prowler disappear into the darkness. The man had been crouching under Claude's 16-year-old daughter's bedroom window. Claude chased him off. The prowler escaped, vaulting a fence with athletic ease. Claude Snelling, 45, was a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias. He loved teaching, loved working with students, loved his family. He and his wife had raised their daughter in a safe neighborhood where doors were left unlocked and children played outside until dark. That was changing in Visalia, as the Visalia Ransacker terrorized the community. But Claude wasn't the type to live in fear. 6 months after chasing off the prowler, on September 11, 1975, Claude woke around 2 o'clock a.m. to strange noises. He ran through his open back door and into the carport, where a ski-masked man was attempting to kidnap his daughter. The intruder had subdued her with threats, telling her he'd stab or shoot her if she screamed. Claude didn't hesitate. He confronted the masked man. The intruder pulled a gun and shot him twice. Claude staggered back into the house to his wife and collapsed. He died soon after, bleeding out in his own home, while his terrified family watched. The killer punched and kicked his daughter, leaving her on the ground, then fled on a stolen bicycle left nearby. Claude Snelling died protecting his child. In the hierarchy of human acts, few rank higher. His body was buried in Visalia, but his legacy lived on through the journalism students he'd taught. For years after his death, former students dedicated their work to his memory investigative pieces. Feature stories, careers built on skills he'd taught them. One former student became an editor at a major California newspaper and kept Claude's photo on his desk for 30 years. His daughter graduated high school, attended college, built a life. She never forgot the masked face in the carport, but she refused to let that night define her entirely. In 2020, she watched Joseph DeAngelo plead guilty. She didn't speak at the sentencing hearing. Her presence was statement enough. Brian and Katie Maggiore, February 2, 1978, began as an ordinary day for Brian and Katie Maggiore. Brian, 21, was a sergeant in the United States Air Force, stationed at Mather Air Force Base near Sacramento. Katie, 20, was his high school sweetheart. They'd been married less than a year. That evening, they took their dog for a walk through their quiet Rancho Cordova neighborhood. It was a routine they followed most nights, a chance to exercise their beagle and enjoy each other's company. Around 9 o'clock p.m., as they walked along La Alegria Drive, they encountered someone in the darkness. What happened next would be reconstructed later from witness statements and physical evidence, but the basic facts are undisputed. A man confronted them. He may have been prowling in the area, preparing for an attack on another victim, when the Maggiores and their dog surprised him, or he may have targeted them specifically. Either way, the encounter turned violent. Witnesses heard shouting. They heard a woman scream, "I'm going to call the police." The Maggiores apparently tried to run. The beagle's leash was found dropped on the street. The attacker chased Brian and Katie into a backyard on La Loma Drive. There, he shot them both. Brian was shot in the chest. Katie was shot in the head. Both died within minutes. Their bodies were found in the yard by responding officers. Their dog was discovered wandering the neighborhood. Confused and alone, Brian Maggiore had served his country. He was stationed at Mather Air Force Base, working in aircraft maintenance, building a military career. Katie was starting her own career, working as a clerk. They just bought their first house. They were young in love and planning a future together. That future ended in a stranger's backyard on a February night when they crossed paths with a predator. Brian and Katie Maggiore were buried together in Fresno, their headstones side by side, just as they'd walked together that final evening. The inscription reads simply, "Together forever." Their beagle was adopted by a neighbor who'd heard the shots that night. The dog lived another 8 years, growing old in a home where people understood why sudden noises made him tremble. At DeAngelo's sentencing, a photograph was entered into evidence. Brian and Katie on their wedding day, young and radiant, the future stretching endlessly before them. The photo was taken 14 months before their murders. In it, Katie is laughing at something Brian has whispered. Whatever the joke was, it died with them on La Loma Drive. Charlene and Lemon Smith, 43, was one of Ventura's most respected attorneys. He specialized in family law and had a reputation for fairness, intelligence, and compassion. He was married to Charlene, 33, an interior decorator with an eye for beauty and a warm personality that drew people to her. They lived in a comfortable home in Ventura, a coastal city with the smell of ocean salt hung in the air, and the pace of life was slower than Los Angeles, just down the coast. They'd built a good life together, surrounded by friends and family who loved them. On the night of March 13, 1980, while they slept, someone entered their home. The intruder had planned meticulously, likely stalking them for weeks, learning their routines, choosing his moment. He bound them both with ligatures while they were still disoriented from sleep. Then he bludgeoned Lyman to death with a log from their own fireplace. Charlene was raped and also beaten to death with a log. The violence was extreme. The killer struck them repeatedly, with force that shattered bone and caused massive hemorrhaging. It was overkill. Rage expressed through a blunt object swung again and again. Lyman's desk at his law office remained untouched for months after his death. His partners couldn't bring themselves to clear it. Legal pads with his handwriting. A coffee mug he'd used the morning before his murder. Case files awaiting attention that would never come. Eventually, his secretary packed everything into boxes that his family stored in a garage, unable to throw away, but unable to open. Charlene's decorating portfolio fabric swatches, paint samples, sketches for projects she'd never complete, was donated to a design school. Her sister couldn't bear to look at them. Somewhere, a student may have studied Charlene's work without knowing the woman who created it was murdered at 33. The log from their fireplace was tagged as evidence and stored in a police locker for 38 years. It was just a piece of wood. It had warmed their home on winter evenings. Then Joseph DeAngelo used it to end their lives. Keith and Patrice Harrington. They'd been married for exactly 3 months when they died. Keith Harrington, 24, and Patrice Harrington, 27, had wed in May 1980 in a ceremony surrounded by friends and family. They were deeply in love, starting their lives together with all the optimism of young newlyweds. Keith was a medical student. He'd worked hard to get into medical school, had dreams of becoming a doctor, wanted to help people. Patrice was a nurse. She already spent her days caring for patients, working long shifts, coming home tired but fulfilled. They rented a home in Dana Point, a beautiful coastal area in Orange County. The house was small but comfortable, close to the ocean. A perfect place to start their marriage. On the night of August 19th, 1980, they went to bed like any other night. Keith had studying to do. Patrice had an early shift the next day. They had no idea someone had been watching their home, learning their patterns, waiting for the right moment. The intruder entered through an unlocked sliding door. He attacked them while they slept, binding them before they fully understood what was happening. Patrice was raped, and both were bludgeoned to death with overwhelming force. Their bodies were discovered the next day when Patrice didn't show up for her nursing shift, and Keith missed his classes. Colleagues and friends knew immediately something was wrong. Neither would simply not show up without calling. 3 months of marriage. That's what Keith and Patrice Harrington had together. 92 days between I do and death. Their wedding gifts were still in boxes when they died, kitchen appliances never unboxed. Towels still in packaging, a future assembled but never unpacked. Patrice's wedding dress hung in the closet of the Dana Point house, worn once. Her mother eventually donated it to a charity that provides gowns to brides who can't afford them. Someone else walked down the aisle in Beatrice's dress, unaware of its history. Keith's medical school application had been accepted 2 weeks before his murder. His acceptance letter arrived at his parents' home after his death. They opened it. Read the congratulations for an achievement their son would never celebrate, and placed it in a box they kept in their attic for the next 38 years. When DeAngelo was arrested, Keith's surviving brother retrieved the letter. He read it aloud at the sentencing hearing. Manuela Withen, 28, was supposed to be safe. Her husband David was in the hospital, recovering from a minor surgery. Manuela was staying at their home in Irvine, a planned community known for low crime and safe streets. Her mother had offered to stay with her, but Manuela had declined. She'd be fine for one night alone. On the evening of February 5, 1981, Manuela settled in for the night. She had work the next day. She was employed at a legal office as a secretary. Known for her efficiency and friendly demeanor, she probably planned to visit David at the hospital the following day, bringing him magazines or his favorite foods. She never got that chance. Sometime during the night, Joseph James DeAngelo broke into the Withen home. He'd likely been watching for days, had seen David leave in an ambulance, realized Manuela would be alone. Manuela fought. The evidence at the scene showed she struggled desperately. She tried to defend herself, to escape, to survive. But DeAngelo overpowered her. He raped her and beat her to death. David Withen checked out of the hospital, expecting to continue his recovery at home, with Manuela caring for him. Instead, he found his wife's body in a crime scene that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. For years, David kept Manuela's coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet, exactly where she'd left it. He couldn't use it. He couldn't throw it away. It sat there, a small ceramic monument to ordinary mornings that ended on February 5, 1981. David eventually remarried, had children, built something resembling a normal life, but he told interviewers that every February 5th, he woke before dawn and sat alone in the dark, remembering, "She was supposed to be safe," he said. "I was supposed to protect her. I was in a hospital bed while she was dying." The Irvine house where Manuela died was sold. The new owners had no idea a woman had been murdered in their bedroom. California law only requires disclosure of deaths within 3 years. Manuela's death faded from the property records, if not from memory. Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez. Sherry Domingo, 35, was a single mother raising a teenage son in Goleta. She'd been divorced for several years and was focused on her career and her child. She worked hard to provide a stable home, to be both mother and father to her boy. In the summer of 1981, Sherry started dating Gregory Sanchez. 27, Greg was an electronics technician, smart and handy, with an easy smile and a good heart. He treated Sherry's son well, which mattered enormously to Sherry. She was cautious about who she let into their lives. But Greg had proven himself trustworthy and kind. On the night of July 26, 1981, Greg stayed over at Sherry's home. Her son was spending the night elsewhere. It was a rare evening alone together, a chance to enjoy each other's company without the responsibilities of parenting. Sherry and Greg had no way of knowing that someone had been watching the house, that someone had noticed when her son left for the night. That someone was already planning an attack. Sometime in the early morning hours of July 27th, DeAngelo broke into Sherry's home. He attacked them while they slept, binding them before they could fully react. Greg fought. He struggled against his bonds, Trying desperately to protect Sherry, the killer beat him with a blunt instrument, possibly a pipe or a log, with such ferocity that Greg's skull was fractured. The blows caused massive brain hemorrhaging. He died from the trauma. Sherry was raped. Then she was beaten to death as well, suffering similar massive head trauma. Sherry Domingo's son was a teenager when he discovered his mother's body. He became a man carrying that weight, the door opening, the hallway, the bedroom, the scene no child should witness. He didn't speak publicly about the case for decades. When DeAngelo was arrested, reporters sought him out. He declined interviews. Some trauma doesn't translate into sound bites. Gregory Sanchez was 27 years old. He just started dating Sherry, just started imagining a future with her. His sister told the court in 2020 that Greg had called their mother the day before his murder, excited about Sherry, talking about weekend plans. He was happy, his sister said. That's the last thing I remember about him. He was finally happy. The Goleta house where they died was demolished in 1998. A new structure stands on the lot now, housing a family with young children. They plant flowers in the backyard where Sherry used to garden. Life goes on, as it must, atop soil that absorbed blood 40 years ago. Janelle Cruz was 18 years old. Weeks away from graduating high school, she had her whole life ahead of her college applications. First real job, independence, adulthood. She was excited about the future, about leaving behind childhood and becoming who she was meant to be. On the evening of May 4th, 1986, Janelle was home alone in her family's house in Irvine. Her parents and siblings were out for the evening. It was a normal Southern California night, warm and quiet. Janelle had no reason to be afraid. Irvine was safe. Her neighborhood was safe. Her family always came home. She probably watched television, talked on the phone with friends, did homework. Whatever ordinary things teenagers do on a Sunday night. Joseph James DeAngelo had been watching the house. He knew the family's routines. He knew when Janelle would be alone. He broke in and attacked her in her bedroom. She was raped and beaten to death with a pipe wrench taken from the family's garage. The violence was extreme, brutal, and utterly senseless. When Janelle's family came home, they found her dead. The scene, the horror, the incomprehensibility of finding their daughter and sister murdered in her own bedroom. It destroyed the family. Janelle's mother, Debbie, would spend the next 32 years haunted by guilt. She'd left Janelle alone. She'd been out enjoying an evening while her daughter was being murdered. Rationally, Debbie knew she couldn't have predicted this, couldn't have prevented it, but grief and guilt don't follow rational patterns. Janelle Cruz was 18 years old, and her future fit in a pile of papers on her desk: college brochures, rental listings, job applications. She'd circled apartments she could afford on a secretary's salary. She'd calculated how many hours she'd need to work to pay rent and still attend classes. She was planning a life that would last 60 more years. It lasted 2 more weeks. Her bedroom remained untouched for years. Debbie Cruz couldn't enter it. The circled rental ads yellowed. The acceptance letters sat unanswered. Janelle's hairbrush still held strands of her hair. Her mother couldn't bear to clean it. When investigators finally identified DeAngelo in 2018, they found something unexpected in his home. A diamond pendant matching one stolen from a victim in 1978. For 40 years, DeAngelo had kept trophies. Somewhere in his collection of stolen items may have been something that belonged to Janelle, a small piece of her future, pocketed by her killer and stored as a souvenir at the sentencing hearing. Debbie Cruz spoke last among the family members. She was 73 years old. She'd spent half her adult life waiting for this moment. When she finished her statement, she turned to leave the podium, then stopped. "She was my baby," Debbie said, her voice breaking. "She was my baby. And she's gone." That was it. That was everything the rape survivors. Beyond the 13 murder victims, Joseph James DeAngelo raped at least 51 women across Northern and Southern California. Each of these women is a survivor, not just a victim. Each lived with trauma for decades. Many deserve to have their stories told, but most have chosen to remain anonymous. And that choice must be respected, however. 2 survivors who have spoken publicly deserve mention. Chris Pedretti was 15 years old when DeAngelo attacked her on December 18, 1976. For more than 2 hours, he raped her repeatedly, alternating between leaving her outside naked in the December cold and bringing her back inside for more assaults. Chris survived and gave detailed testimony that helped establish the East Area Rapist's pattern. For 44 years, Chris lived with the trauma. She went to therapy. She struggled with PTSD. She married and had children and built a life, but the attack was always there. A shadow she couldn't fully escape. In August 2020, Chris stood in a Sacramento courtroom and confronted Joseph James DeAngelo. She read a victim impact statement describing what he'd done to her, how it had affected her life, how she'd survived despite him. She looked directly at him and reclaimed her power. "I am free," she told the courtroom. "I am finally free." Another survivor, identified only as Jane Doe to protect her privacy, described being attacked in 1977 when she was 16 years old. DeAngelo broke into her home, raped her repeatedly, and whispered threats that haunted her for decades. She married, had children, and never told anyone what had happened. Not her husband, not her kids, not her closest friends. She carried that secret for 43 years until DeAngelo was arrested. Only then, with her rapist finally identified, could she begin to speak about what happened. There are 49 other rape survivors with similar stories. Women who were attacked in their homes, in their beds, in what should have been their safest spaces. Women who spent decades looking over their shoulders, triple-checking locks, unable to sleep without lights on. Women who struggled through marriages and careers and motherhood with trauma they couldn't fully articulate. These women survived. They built lives. They refused to let Joseph James DeAngelo destroy them completely. But they lost years to fear, decades to hypervigilance, lifetimes to trauma that never fully heals. For more than 3 decades after Janelle Cruz's murder in May 1986, Joseph James DeAngelo lived a remarkably ordinary life. He worked as a truck mechanic at a Save Mart Supermarket's distribution center in Roseville, California, from 1990 until his retirement in 2017. He mowed his lawn. He attended family gatherings. He aged from a stocky 40-year-old to a white-haired, 72-year-old man who looked like anyone's grandfather. But investigators never stopped searching for the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. In 2001, a breakthrough occurred that wouldn't bear fruit for 17 more years. DNA testing, which hadn't existed during DeAngelo's active crime period, had advanced to the point where investigators could compare samples from different crime scenes. Criminalist Paul Holes at the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office ran DNA from an East Area Rapist case against DNA from an original Night Stalker case. They matched. The East Area Rapist from Northern California and the original Night Stalker from Southern California were the same person. The realization was stunning. Investigators had been searching for 2 different offenders, Now they knew they were hunting one serial rapist and killer who'd operated across the entire state for 12 years. The case took on new urgency. In 2011, at a press conference marking the 30th anniversary of some of the murders, investigators revealed the DNA connection publicly. They appealed for new tips, new witnesses, new information. Nothing broke. In 2013, true crime writer Michelle McNamara became obsessed with the case. She began deep research, compiling information from multiple jurisdictions, interviewing survivors and investigators, synthesizing decades of scattered case files into a coherent narrative. She coined the term Golden State Killer to refer to the East Area Rapist original Night Stalker, giving the case a new name that captured public attention. McNamara worked closely with Paul Holes, who had become the lead investigator on the Golden State Killer cold case. They shared information, theories, and frustrations. The case consumed McNamara. She worked late into the night, compiled massive files, and built a website where amateur sleuths could collaborate on the investigation. Tragically, Michelle McNamara died suddenly in her sleep in April 2016 at age 46. Her book about the Golden State Killer case, titled "I'll Be Gone in the Dark," after the words DeAngelo had whispered to 15-year-old Chris Pedretti, was incomplete. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, worked with researchers to finish the book. It was published in February 2018. The book became a bestseller and reignited public interest in the case. But more importantly, it kept pressure on investigators to solve it. In 2016, on the 40th anniversary of the first East Area Rapist attack, the FBI and Sacramento law enforcement held a major press conference. They announced a renewed nationwide effort to catch the Golden State Killer and offered a $50,000 reward. They displayed evidence, including a bicycle the killer had stolen during one of his Visalia Ransacker crimes. The message was clear. This case was not forgotten. This killer, wherever he was, would eventually be caught behind the scenes. Paul Holes was exploring a revolutionary new investigative technique that would change criminal investigations forever. By 2017, Paul Holes had been working on the Golden State Killer case for 24 years. He was approaching retirement from the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, but he was determined to solve this case before leaving. The problem was straightforward, but seemingly insurmountable. Investigators had the killer's DNA from multiple crime scenes, but that DNA didn't match anyone in CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. They'd compared it against millions of convicted offenders and arrestees. Nothing. The killer had either never been arrested for a felony, unlikely given the volume of his crimes, or had committed his crimes before DNA. Databases existed and had avoided arrest since. Holes began exploring a technique called forensic genetic genealogy. The concept was simple, but had never been used before in a criminal investigation. Upload the killer's DNA profile to public genealogy databases where people voluntarily submit their DNA to find relatives. Then use the matches to build a family tree that could lead to the killer. It was controversial. Privacy advocates would later argue that using public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes violated expectations of privacy. But it was legal, and Holes was desperate for a breakthrough. He partnered with Barbara Ray Venter, a genetic genealogist who'd helped identify the body of a child known as Lisa in an unrelated case. Ray Venter had expertise in building family trees from DNA matches, tracing relationships back generations to find common ancestors. In late 2017 and early 2018, the team uploaded a DNA profile generated from the Golden State Killer's crime scene evidence to GetMatch, a public genealogy website where users share DNA data from testing companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. GetMatch's database contained about 1 million profiles. When the Golden State Killer's DNA was uploaded, it matched several individuals who were genetic relatives, third or fourth cousins. Barbara Ray Venter went to work. She built family trees from these distant cousin matches, tracing branches back to common ancestors born in the 1800s, then forward through generations to identify everyone descended from those ancestors. It was painstaking work, requiring cross-referencing with genealogical records, obituaries, marriage certificates, and birth records. Slowly, a picture emerged. The DNA evidence suggested the killer was descended from certain families with roots in California's Italian-American communities. The family trees narrowed the possibilities. Investigators overlaid geographic data. Where did descendants of these families live? Who was the right age? Who lived in California during the crime periods? One name kept appearing: Joseph James DeAngelo, Jr., born November 8, 1945. He'd lived in Rancho Cordova during the East Area Rapist attacks. He'd worked as a police officer in Exeter and Auburn during key crime periods. He'd moved to Southern California around the time the original Night Stalker attacks began. He'd lived in Citrus Heights, just miles from where many crimes occurred. Investigators obtained DMV records. They found photographs of DeAngelo from his police officer days and compared them to composite sketches from the 1970s. There were similarities, but they needed definitive DNA evidence. They couldn't arrest someone based solely on genetic genealogy. They needed a direct DNA match from DeAngelo himself. In April 2018, investigators began surveillance on Joseph James DeAngelo. He was 72 years old, retired, living in a house in Citrus Heights with one of his daughters and a granddaughter. He drove an old car, ran errands, seemed like an ordinary elderly man. Investigators followed him, waiting for him to discard something with his DNA on it. On April 23, 2018, DeAngelo left his house and drove to a Hobby Lobby store. He discarded items in a public trash can. Investigators retrieved them. They contained DeAngelo's DNA. The crime lab ran the sample overnight. It was a match. Joseph James DeAngelo's DNA matched DNA from multiple East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker crime scenes. They had their killer on the morning of April 24, 2018. Joseph James DeAngelo stepped outside his house on Canyon Oak Drive in Citrus Heights. It was a sunny Tuesday morning. He was wearing a casual shirt and slacks, looking like any other elderly man starting his day. Suddenly, he was surrounded by law enforcement. Officers from multiple agencies: FBI, Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. Local police converged on him from vehicles parked up and down the street. "Joseph James DeAngelo, you're under arrest," an officer announced. DeAngelo's face registered confusion. He asked what the arrest was for. Officers didn't answer immediately. They handcuffed him, read him his rights, and placed him in the back of a police car. Neighbors watched in shock. Joe DeAngelo? The quiet old man who yelled at people about their dogs barking and kept to himself. What could he possibly have done? At 10:30 a.m., the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office held a press conference that would shock California and the entire nation. "Today, we have arrested Joseph James DeAngelo," District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert announced. "We believe Joseph James DeAngelo is the East Area Rapist." The room of reporters erupted. The East Area Rapist, who terrorized Sacramento in the 1970s. He'd been caught? Schubert continued, through DNA evidence and investigation. DeAngelo was linked to multiple murders across California. He was being charged initially with 8 counts of first-degree murder in crimes in Sacramento, Ventura, Orange, and Santa Barbara counties. The announcement made national news within minutes. Cable networks interrupted regular programming. Newspapers rushed to update their websites. The Golden State Killer, who'd evaded capture for 44 years, had been identified and arrested. He was a former police officer. He'd been living in suburban Sacramento, less than 20 miles from where many of his crimes occurred. He'd been hiding in plain sight for more than 4 decades. Paul Holes, who'd retired just 3 months earlier, watched the press conference from home. He'd dedicated 24 years to catching this killer and had left law enforcement in March 2018, thinking the case might never be solved. Now, just weeks after his retirement, the breakthrough had come. Michelle McNamara's husband, Patton Oswalt, released a statement. If you want to know what Michelle's hopes were for the man responsible, well, it's in the book. She didn't want him glorified, or to have his photo on a book jacket. And I agree completely. But she did want him found, captured, and most important of all, she wanted the victims and survivors to be made whole, and to come out of the dark. Today is that first new day. Michelle just found out through me, and I hope it gives her peace. Michelle's daughter issued a simple statement. There are no words to describe the elation. DeAngelo was held without bail at the Sacramento County Main Jail. He appeared briefly in court on April 27, 2018, sitting in a wheelchair. Looking frail and disoriented, he said nothing. His arraignment was delayed to give prosecutors time to build their case. Within weeks, charges were filed in multiple counties. The legal question became, how do you prosecute someone for crimes spread across 6 counties? How do you bring order to such a massive case? It would take more than 2 years to answer those questions. As prosecutors prepared their case against Joseph James DeAngelo, the scale of the evidence against him was staggering. DNA evidence was the cornerstone. DeAngelo's DNA matched crime scene evidence from 13 murders and numerous rapes. The samples had been preserved for decades. Semen, blood, skin cells stored in evidence lockers across California. When tested against DeAngelo's DNA, they matched with scientific certainty, but there was more than DNA. Investigators obtained search warrants for DeAngelo's home on Canyon Oak Drive in Citrus Heights. What they found painted a picture of a man obsessed with his crimes and terrified of being caught. The house was filled with stolen items. Hundreds of objects, jewelry, earrings, cufflinks, coins, medallions that matched descriptions of items stolen during East Area Rapist attacks in the 1970s. DeAngelo had kept trophies from his crimes for 40 years. Investigators found a trove of photographs. Many showed DeAngelo in his police uniform from his days in Exeter and Auburn. Others showed family gatherings, vacations, ordinary moments from a seemingly ordinary life. They found journals and maps. DeAngelo had kept notes, though the content was not released publicly. Prosecutors would later reference writings that showed his awareness of the investigations, his following of media coverage, his tracking of whether police were getting close in the garage. Investigators found tools that could have been used in his crimes. A pipe wrench similar to the one used to kill Janelle Cruz. Rope and ligatures, flashlights, ski masks. Some of these items were decades old, as if DeAngelo couldn't bring himself to throw them away. Interviews with neighbors revealed DeAngelo's strange behavior in recent years. He'd been prone to screaming profanity-laced tirades at neighbors whose dogs barked. One neighbor reported receiving a phone message from DeAngelo threatening to deliver a load of death over a barking dog. The rage was always just beneath the surface. His former colleagues from the Auburn Police Department were interviewed. Many expressed shock. They'd worked beside DeAngelo, trusted him, never suspected anything. But a few remembered odd incidents. DeAngelo disappearing during shifts, calling in sick frequently during periods when East Area Rapist attacks occurred. His obsessive following of the East Area Rapist case in newspapers. The chief who'd fired DeAngelo in 1979 told investigators that DeAngelo had threatened to kill him after being terminated. The threat had been taken seriously at the time, and the chief had taken precautions. But DeAngelo never followed through. Bonnie Colwell, DeAngelo's ex-fiancée from the early 1970s, was interviewed extensively. She described his controlling behavior, his need to dominate, his sexual practices that eerily mirrored the East Area Rapist's behavior. She spoke about the night he showed up at her window with a gun, demanding she marry him. When investigators told Bonnie about the July 1978 attack in Davis, when the rapist had sobbed into the victim's pillow crying, "I hate you," Bonnie, she broke down. For 40 years, the Golden State Killer had been driven, at least in part, by rage at her rejection. Survivors had suffered because DeAngelo couldn't accept that she'd ended their relationship. DeAngelo's wife, Sharon Huddle, filed for divorce in July 2018. Just 3 months after his arrest, in her filing, she stated she'd had no knowledge of his crimes and had been betrayed and deceived throughout their 45-year marriage. The divorce was finalized in 2019. His 3 daughters issued a statement expressing shock and heartbreak. They'd believed their father was a regular guy, a mechanic who'd worked hard and provided for his family. Now they learned he was one of California's most prolific serial killers. They expressed sympathy for his victims and stated they wanted nothing to do with him. The evidence against Joseph James DeAngelo was overwhelming. DNA placed him at crime scenes. Stolen items linked him to burglaries. His own behavior and history fit the profile perfectly. There was no question of his guilt. The only question was, would there be a trial? The legal challenge facing prosecutors was unprecedented. Joseph James DeAngelo was suspected of crimes in at least 6 California counties: Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Clara, Stanislaus Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Orange. Each county had its own district attorney, its own jurisdiction, its own interest in prosecuting. How do you coordinate a case of this magnitude? Sacramento County took the lead. District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert and Deputy D.I. Thien Ho became the primary prosecutors. But they worked closely with prosecutors from the other counties, particularly Ventura and Santa Barbara, where some of the most brutal murders had occurred. The first challenge was determining which crimes to charge. DNA evidence linked DeAngelo definitively to 13 murders. But California's statute of limitations on pre-2017 rape cases meant DeAngelo could not be charged with the 51 rapes he'd committed. The statute had expired. This created a terrible irony. DeAngelo had raped dozens of women who survived and had to live with that trauma for decades. But he couldn't be prosecuted for those rapes. Only the murders, where victims couldn't testify, could be charged. However, prosecutors found a workaround. They charged DeAngelo with 13 counts of kidnapping related to the rapes. Kidnapping has no statute of limitations when combined with aggravated circumstances. By arguing that DeAngelo had moved victims from room to room or held them against their will, prosecutors could bring charges that referenced the rapes without being limited by the statute. On August 13, 2018, DeAngelo was formally charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and 13 counts of kidnapping. The special circumstances allegations multiple murders and murders committed during rape and robbery made him eligible for the death penalty. DeAngelo's attorneys, Diane Howard and Fien Ho, not related to the prosecutor, faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA don't lie. Their client was 72 years old. In declining health and facing certain conviction, they pursued the only realistic strategy: negotiate a plea deal that would spare DeAngelo the death penalty. Negotiations dragged on for nearly 2 years. Victims' families were divided. Some wanted DeAngelo executed. Others wanted him to plead guilty and spare everyone the trauma of a trial. Some wanted to confront him in court. Others wanted to avoid reliving the worst moments of their lives through testimony. Prosecutors faced a difficult calculation. If they pursued the death penalty and won, DeAngelo would likely die of natural causes on death row before being executed. California hadn't executed anyone since 2006, and Governor Gavin Newsom had imposed a moratorium on executions in 2019. A trial would cost millions of dollars, traumatize victims and survivors, and potentially take years. A plea deal offered certainty. DeAngelo would plead guilty to all charges, admit to all crimes including those beyond the statute of limitations, receive life in prison without parole, and never be released. Victims and survivors would get their day in court through impact statements without having to endure cross-examination. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo appeared in Sacramento County Superior Court via video link from his jail cell. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, the proceedings were modified to limit in-person attendance. Wearing an orange jail uniform and a mask, DeAngelo sat at a table, flanked by his attorneys. Judge Michael Bowman addressed him directly. "Mr. DeAngelo, you are charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. How do you plead?" In a barely audible voice, DeAngelo responded, "Guilty." He repeated the word 13 times. Once for each murder count, Judge Bowman then addressed the kidnapping charges and asked DeAngelo to admit to additional uncharged crimes as part of the plea agreement. This was crucial by admitting to the rapes and other crimes. DeAngelo waived his right to claim innocence or appeal later. "Mr. DeAngelo, do you admit that in June 1976, you broke into a residence in Rancho Cordova and raped a woman at knife point?" Yes. The process continued for hours. DeAngelo admitted to more than 50 rapes, over 120 burglaries, and numerous other crimes committed between 1974 and 1986. Each admission was placed on the record, ensuring no legal ambiguity. As part of the plea deal, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. DeAngelo would be sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, 13 consecutive life sentences, effectively guaranteeing he would die in prison. The courtroom limited to family members, attorneys, and essential personnel was silent, except for DeAngelo's monotone admissions. After 44 years, the Golden State Killer was finally admitting his crimes. Judge Bowman set sentencing for August 2020 and announced that victim impact statements would be heard over multiple days. The plea deal was controversial. Some victims' families felt betrayed that DeAngelo wouldn't face the death penalty. Others were relieved they wouldn't have to endure a lengthy trial. But everyone agreed on one thing. They wanted to confront him. Because Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty, there was no trial. There were no witnesses testifying, no cross-examinations, no jury deliberations. This spared victims and survivors the trauma of testifying in detail about their assaults. It spared families of murder victims from hearing gruesome details presented as evidence. It saved millions in court costs and years of legal proceedings. But it also meant there would be no public airing of all the evidence. No detailed examination of how DeAngelo committed his crimes, how he avoided detection for so long, what motivated him, the truth about Joseph James DeAngelo's psychology, his methods, his 32-year dormancy. After 1986, all of that remains partially mysterious. He never explained himself. He never testified. He simply pleaded guilty and accepted his sentence. The only opportunity for public confrontation would come during victim impact statements. From August 18th to August 20th, 2020, victims and family members confronted Joseph James DeAngelo in the Sacramento County Superior Courtroom. Over 3 days, more than 50 people spoke. DeAngelo sat at the defense table, hunched over, wearing a mask, showing no emotion. He never looked at the speakers. He stared at the table or at the floor. Chris Pedretti, who'd been 15 when DeAngelo attacked her in December 1976, was among the first to speak. She described how the attack had stolen her teenage years, how she'd struggled with PTSD, how she'd been afraid for 44 years. For 44 years, Chris said, her voice strong. I've lived with the memory of your voice, your threats, but today I'm taking back my voice. Today, I am free. She turned and looked directly at DeAngelo. He didn't look up. Another rape survivor, identified as Jane Doe, described her attack when she was 16. She'd never told anyone about it, not her husband, not her children. She'd carried that secret for 43 years. Buried it deep, tried to forget. You took my teenage years, she said. You made me afraid to sleep. You made me afraid of darkness, but I survived you. I built a life, I raised children, and you've been caught. Gay and Bob Hardwick spoke about their daughter, Keith Harrington's sister-in-law, and their grief at losing Keith and Patrice so early in their marriage. Bob Hardwick called DeAngelo a miserable, pathetic creature who destroyed young love. Keith was my youngest brother, said one of Keith Harrington's siblings. He was smart, kind, funny. He was going to be a doctor. He was going to help people. You took that away. You took away 38 years of his life. 38 years of Patrice's life. You took away the children they would have had. The grandchildren will never meet. The calculation of stolen time was a recurring theme. Speakers tallied the years. 40 years, 38 years, 34 years. They described milestones that never happened. Weddings, births, graduations, grandchildren. They spoke of holidays spent grieving instead of celebrating. Debbie Cruz, Janelle's mother, spoke about her daughter's murder in May 1986. Her voice broke multiple times. She described Janelle at 18, full of life and plans. She described coming home and finding her daughter dead. For 32 years, Debbie said. I've lived with guilt. I left her alone. I've asked myself a million times, what if I'd stayed home? What if I'd come home earlier? I know it's not my fault, but guilt doesn't listen to reason. She turned toward DeAngelo. You took my baby girl. You took her future, her potential, everything she could have been. And for what? Why? Why did you do this? DeAngelo didn't answer. He never looked up. Margaret Wardlow, raped by DeAngelo in 1977, spoke about decades of hypervigilance. I've never felt safe since you attacked me, she said. I check and recheck locks. I can't sleep without lights on. Every noise terrifies me. You didn't kill my body, but you tried to kill my spirit. But I'm still here. Family members of Lyman and Charlene Smith spoke about the lawyer and decorator who'd been murdered in their Ventura home in 1980. Colleagues described Lyman's dedication to his clients, his fairness, his kindness. Friends described Charlene's warmth, her creativity, her joy. They were beloved, one friend said. They were building a life together. You broke into their home and destroyed them. You destroyed everyone who loved them. A family member of Brian and Katie Majori spoke about the young Air Force couple killed in February 1978. Katie's mother, Lorraine, had passed away in the years since DeAngelo's arrest, but a relative spoke on her behalf. Lorraine spent 40 years searching for justice, the relative said. She never gave up. She appeared on television, spoke to reporters, kept pressure on investigators. She lived long enough to know you were caught, but not long enough to see you sentenced. That's another thing you took from this family. The prosecutor, Thien Ho. Read victim impact statements on behalf of people who couldn't attend or preferred not to speak publicly. Each statement was searing descriptions of trauma. Loss, destroyed families, lifelong suffering. One rape survivor's statement described how the attack had destroyed her marriage. Her husband couldn't cope with what had happened to her. They divorced within a year. You didn't just rape me, her statement read. You destroyed my marriage, my trust, my ability to be intimate with anyone. Another survivor described attempting suicide in the years after her attack. I didn't want to live with what you did to me, her statement read, but I survived, and I refused to let you win. The statements continued for 3 days. The emotional weight in the courtroom was crushing. Bailiffs wiped tears. Reporters struggled to maintain professional composure. Family members held each other, sobbing through it all. Joseph James DeAngelo sat motionless. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no reaction. It was as if he wasn't hearing them, as if their pain didn't register. On the final day, Judge Michael Bowman addressed the courtroom. He acknowledged the courage of everyone who'd spoken. He praised survivors for their resilience and families for their perseverance. Then he asked DeAngelo if he had anything to say. DeAngelo's attorneys helped him stand. He shuffled to a microphone. In a barely audible, weak voice, he spoke. I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry for everyone I've hurt. It was 9 seconds. 9 seconds after 3 days of victim impact statements. 9 seconds after 44 years. Many in the courtroom found his apology hollow. Performative, meaningless. He'd shown no emotion during the statements. He'd admitted guilt only to avoid the death penalty. Now, when it no longer mattered, he offered 9 seconds of regret. Judge Bowman addressed DeAngelo directly. Mr. DeAngelo, you committed unconscionable acts of violence. You terrorized communities. You destroyed lives. The harm you caused is immeasurable. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, and I believe that is appropriate. On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to 13 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus an additional 8 years. Life without parole means exactly that. DeAngelo will die in prison. There will be no parole hearings, no opportunity for release, no chance of freedom. He is 74 years old. He will die incarcerated. The consecutive nature of the sentences is symbolic, but important. Each life sentence represents a victim, even if one sentence were somehow overturned on appeal, which is virtually impossible given the DNA evidence and guilty plea. 12 others would remain. After sentencing, DeAngelo was transferred to California State Prison, Corcoran, a high-security facility in California's Central Valley. He's housed in a protective custody unit, separated from the general prison population. As a former police officer and a notorious criminal, He'd be targeted by other inmates if placed in general population. His daily routine is monotonous. He's confined to his cell for most of the day. He has limited contact with other inmates. He receives no visitors. His daughters have disowned him. His ex-wife wants nothing to do with him. His siblings have remained silent. At 74, his health is declining. He appeared frail during court proceedings, sitting in a wheelchair, hunched over. Looking far older than his years, prison medical staff monitor him, but he's not receiving special treatment. For a man who spent 12 years controlling others, terrorizing them, dominating them completely, prison is the ultimate loss of control. He controls nothing. He decides nothing. He lives at the mercy of guards, schedules, and routines set by others. In the courtroom after sentencing, family members expressed mixed emotions. Some felt relief it was over. DeAngelo would never hurt anyone again. Others felt anger that he hadn't received the death penalty. A few felt emptiness. No punishment could bring back their loved ones or erase decades of trauma. Sacramento District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert held a press conference after sentencing. She praised the courage of survivors who testified and families who'd waited decades for justice. She thanked Paul Holes and the dozens of investigators who'd worked the case over 44 years. She also addressed the controversial use of genetic genealogy that had led to DeAngelo's arrest. This technique is legal, ethical, and necessary, she said. It breaks cold cases that couldn't be solved any other way. Joseph DeAngelo thought he'd gotten away with his crimes. He was wrong. The genetic genealogy technique used to identify DeAngelo has since been used to solve dozens of other cold cases across the United States. It's revolutionized criminal investigation, allowing law enforcement to identify suspects from old DNA evidence by tracing family relationships through public databases. Privacy advocates continue to debate whether this violates expectations of privacy when people submit DNA to genealogy websites. But for families of victims, the debate is simple. This technology caught a serial killer who'd evaded justice for 44 years. Joseph James DeAngelo operated alone. There were no accomplices, no associates who helped him commit crimes or cover them up. Every attack, every murder, every act of terror was his alone, therefore. There were no related prosecutions. No one else was charged in connection with his crimes, however. The case has had significant impact on California law enforcement. Agencies across the state have reopened cold cases, submitting old DNA evidence for genealogical analysis. Dozens of cases have been solved using the same technique that identified DeAngelo. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that no case is ever truly cold if DNA evidence exists. Suspects who thought they'd escaped justice decades ago are now being identified and arrested. For law enforcement, DeAngelo's capture provided vindication and proof that persistence matters. That cold cases can be solved even decades later. That victims deserve justice no matter how much time has passed. The arrest, prosecution, and sentencing of Joseph James DeAngelo provided some closure for victims' families, but closure is not the same as healing. The wounds he inflicted run too deep for any verdict to fully mend. For rape survivors who came forward, speaking about their assaults after decades of silence was both liberating and re-traumatizing. Many had never told anyone, not spouses, not children, not therapists. The arrest forced them to confront memories they'd tried to bury. Chris Pedretti, attacked at 15, spent years in therapy after her testimony. But she's also become an advocate for survivors, speaking publicly about sexual assault and PTSD. She describes the sentencing as giving her back power DeAngelo had stolen. "I'm no longer afraid," she said in interviews after the trial. I faced him. I spoke my truth. I'm free. Other survivors chose to remain anonymous, unwilling to have their identities publicly connected to DeAngelo's crimes. They watched the proceedings from afar, grateful for justice, but unable to participate directly. For them, the arrest brought relief, but also stirred up trauma they'd managed to control through silence. For murder victims' families, the decades of waiting took immeasurable tolls. Children grew up without parents, spouses never remarried, carrying grief that never fully released its hold. Siblings felt survivors' guilt. Debbie Cruz, Janelle's mother, filed a civil lawsuit against Joseph DeAngelo, seeking damages for Janelle's wrongful death. The lawsuit was largely symbolic. DeAngelo has virtually no assets, but it allowed the Cruz family to hold him financially accountable in addition to criminally accountable. The lawsuit was settled for an undisclosed amount, likely the value of DeAngelo's house and any retirement savings. Other families did not pursue civil litigation, recognizing that DeAngelo was effectively judgment-proof. His house in Citrus Heights was sold to satisfy legal judgments and attorney fees. He has no income beyond minimal prison wages. There's nothing to collect. Keith Harrington's brothers established a scholarship fund in Keith and Patricia's names at their alma mater, providing financial assistance to medical and nursing students. It's a way of honoring what Keith and Patrice worked toward, a way of creating something positive from devastating loss. Lyman Smith's law firm created an annual award for family law attorneys who demonstrate extraordinary compassion and ethical practice. It's given in Lyman's name and keeps his memory alive in the legal community he served. The families of Brian and Cady Majori created a memorial garden at a Sacramento park, a quiet space where people can reflect. A plaque honors the young couple whose evening walk ended in tragedy. For the families, the trauma continues even after DeAngelo's imprisonment. Anniversaries of murders are painful. Media coverage of the case triggers grief. The knowledge that DeAngelo is still alive while their loved ones are gone creates ongoing anguish. Some families found solace in connecting with each other. They formed support networks, attended court proceedings together, and shared their grief in ways that people outside the experience can't fully understand. There's a kinship among those who've survived DeAngelo's violence. They're part of a club no one wanted to join, but that provides crucial support. Mental health professionals have noted that many survivors and family members struggle with PTSD, depression, and anxiety related to the crimes. The trauma doesn't end with a verdict. It continues, sometimes for life, manageable, but never fully erased. The impact on DeAngelo's own family, his 3 daughters, his ex-wife, his siblings is also profound. They're victims in a different way, having loved and trusted someone who committed monstrous acts. They've lost the person they thought they knew and must live with the knowledge that their father, husband, brother was a serial killer and rapist. Sharon Huddle, DeAngelo's ex-wife, has never spoken publicly about the case. She divorced him immediately after his arrest, reclaimed her maiden name, and disappeared from public view. The betrayal 45 years of marriage to a serial killer is unfathomable. His daughters, likewise, have remained silent. They released one brief statement expressing sympathy for victims and stating they wanted no contact with their father. They've had to reconcile that the man who attended their school events, walked them down the aisle at their weddings, played with their children, was simultaneously one of California's most prolific criminals. The Golden State Killer case exposed significant weaknesses in law enforcement coordination and led to several important reforms. Multi-jurisdictional coordination. In the 1970s and 1980s, when DeAngelo was actively committing crimes, Law enforcement agencies rarely shared information effectively across jurisdictional boundaries. The East Area Rapist Task Force operated in Sacramento, but agencies in Contra Costa, Stanislaus, and other counties maintained separate investigations with minimal coordination. This allowed DeAngelo to exploit gaps. When Sacramento became too hot, he moved to Contra Costa County. When Northern California was on high alert, he moved to Southern California. Each move essentially gave him a fresh start. After his arrest, California law enforcement agencies made commitments to improve information sharing. The California Department of Justice enhanced its statewide database systems, making it easier for agencies to identify crime patterns that cross jurisdictional lines. DNA database expansion. California already had one of the nation's most extensive DNA databases, collecting samples from all convicted felons. But the Golden State Killer case demonstrated that even comprehensive databases aren't enough if the perpetrator committed crimes before DNA collection began or avoided arrest. California expanded its DNA collection to include all arrestees, not just convicted felons. This expanded database has led to numerous cold case solutions. Forensic genetic genealogy protocols. The use of genetic genealogy to identify DeAngelo was controversial. Privacy advocates argued it violated expectations of privacy. Law enforcement needed clear protocols. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Justice issued interim guidelines for using forensic genetic genealogy. The guidelines restrict its use to violent crimes and unidentified human remains cases. They require investigators to exhaust traditional methods first. They mandate that profiles uploaded to public databases include only DNA markers, not personal information. California followed with state-level guidelines. These regulations attempt to balance privacy concerns with the legitimate needs of criminal investigation. Cold case units. Many California law enforcement agencies created or expanded cold case units after DeAngelo's arrest. These units focus specifically on unsolved crimes where DNA evidence exists. Using modern technology to re-examine old cases, dozens of cold cases have been solved using similar genetic genealogy techniques since 2018. The success of the Golden State Killer investigation proved that cold cases are solvable, which justified allocating resources to cold case units. Victim services improvements. The Golden State Killer case highlighted the lifelong trauma suffered by rape survivors and murder victims' families. Many survivors reported that law enforcement's handling of their cases in the 1970s was insensitive, sometimes re-traumatizing. California invested in improved victim services, including trauma-informed interview techniques, better rape kit processing, and long-term support for survivors. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office created a dedicated victim services coordinator position for major cold cases. Statute of limitations reform. The fact that DeAngelo couldn't be prosecuted for his rapes due to statutes of limitations was deeply frustrating for survivors and prosecutors. In response, California reformed its sexual assault statutes of limitations. As of 2017, California eliminated the statute of limitations for rape and other serious sexual assaults. This means future cases can be prosecuted regardless of how much time has passed. As long as DNA evidence exists to identify the perpetrator, not everyone agrees that institutional reforms went far enough. Privacy advocates continue to express concern about genetic genealogy and database expansions. Civil libertarians worry about the growth of DNA collection from arrestees who may never be convicted. But for victims and their families, these reforms represent progress acknowledgement that the system failed to catch. DeAngelo for decades. and must do better in the future. The Golden State Killer case has had enormous cultural impact, particularly in the true crime community. Books: Michelle McNamara's I'll Be Gone in the Dark, 2018, became a #1 New York Times bestseller and introduced millions of readers to the case. The book was praised for its lyrical writing, its focus on victims rather than glorifying the killer, and its meticulous research. After DeAngelo's arrest, numerous other books followed. Evil Has a Name, by Paul Holes and Robin Gaby Fisher, 2021, told the story from the lead investigator's perspective. The People vs. the Golden State Killer, by Thien Ho, 2024, detailed the prosecution from the inside. Dozens of other books, both factual and speculative, have been published about the case, documentaries. HBO produced I'll Be Gone in the Dark, 2020, a 6-part documentary based on McNamara's book. The series combined her investigation with coverage of DeAngelo's arrest and prosecution. It won critical acclaim for its sensitive treatment of survivors. Other documentaries include Golden State Killer, Main Suspect, 2018, Unmasking a Killer, 2018, and numerous episodes of true crime documentary series on Investigation Discovery, Oxygen, and other networks, podcasts. True crime podcasts dedicated extensive coverage to the case. Case File True Crime released a 5-part series in 2017. That many credit with building public interest before DeAngelo's arrest. The prosecutors covered the legal proceedings in detail. My Favorite Murder and Crime Junkie discussed the case on multiple episodes. Academic study. Criminologists and forensic psychologists have studied the Golden State Killer case extensively. Academic papers have examined his methodology, his psychology, his ability to stop offending, or at least avoid detection for 32 years, and the investigation that led to his arrest. The genetic genealogy technique used to identify DeAngelo became a major topic in forensic science, ethics, and law review journals. Universities including Berkeley, Stanford, and USC have incorporated the case into criminal justice curricula. True crime tourism. While not celebrating DeAngelo, true crime enthusiasts have visited locations associated with the case. The neighborhoods in Sacramento where he committed rapes, the homes where murders occurred, though respecting the privacy of current residents, and the courthouse where he was sentenced. This dark tourism makes some people uncomfortable, but it reflects the public's fascination with understanding how such crimes could occur in ordinary suburban neighborhoods. Victim advocacy. The Golden State Killer case elevated conversations about rape trauma, PTSD, and the long-term impact of violent crime. Survivors who spoke publicly became advocates, helping others find their voices. Organizations working with sexual assault survivors report increased awareness and support since the case went public. The visibility of survivors like Chris Pedretti helped destigmatize talking about sexual violence and seeking help. Pop culture references. The case has been referenced in television shows, movies, and other media as an example of forensic science breakthroughs and cold case investigation. It's become shorthand for seemingly unsolvable cases that technology eventually cracked. Public awareness of DNA databases. The case sparked broader public discussion about DNA testing, genetic privacy, and genealogy databases. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com updated their privacy policies and informed users that law enforcement might use their data to solve crimes. Some people deleted their DNA profiles from public databases or chose not to upload them. Others embraced the idea that their DNA might help solve cold cases. The debate continues. Law enforcement recruitment. several law enforcement agencies report increased interest in cold case investigation and forensic science careers following the Golden State Killer case. The high-profile nature of the investigation and its successful resolution made these careers appealing to people who want to help solve seemingly impossible cases. The cultural impact of the Golden State Killer case will likely persist for decades. It represents a turning point in criminal investigation, a cautionary tale about serial predators who hide in plain sight, and a testament to victims who never stopped fighting for justice. The neighborhoods where Joseph James DeAngelo committed his crimes have changed dramatically since the 1970s and 1980s, but the memory of his terror remains embedded in local consciousness. Sacramento suburbs, Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and other eastern Sacramento suburbs were middle-class neighborhoods in the 1970s affordable homes. Good schools, safe streets where children played outside until dark. The East Area Rapist attacks shattered that sense of security. For people who lived through that era, the fear never fully faded. Even after the attacks stopped in 1979, residents remained vigilant. Dogs were purchased. Alarm systems became standard. Women avoided being home alone today. These suburbs have grown and diversified. The neighborhoods where DeAngelo prowled are now denser, more urban. Many homes have been renovated or rebuilt. But older residents remember. They remember community meetings where hundreds of frightened people demanded answers. They remember the palpable fear that hung over the area for years. Goleta, the small coastal community near Santa Barbara, experienced 2 double homicides attributed to the Golden State Killer doctor, Offerman and Debra Manning in December 1979, and Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in July 1981. These murders terrified Goleta residents. The town was small enough that everyone knew someone affected. The randomness of the attacks couples murdered in their homes for no apparent reason made no one feel safe. Goleta has since been incorporated into the city of Santa Barbara and has grown significantly, but memorials remain for the victims. And longtime residents still speak of the original Night Stalker era as a dark period in local history. Irvine. Irvine was designed as a master-planned community with safety as a priority, low crime, controlled access, excellent police presence. The murder of Manuela Withen in 1981 and Janelle Cruz in 1986 shocked residents. These crimes weren't supposed to happen in Irvine. The murders led to increased security measures, neighborhood watch programs, and heightened police patrols. Irvine remains one of California's safest cities, but the Golden State Killer murders are part of local history. Economic impact. Some real estate professionals report that homes where murders occurred can be difficult to sell. Even decades later, California law requires disclosure of deaths that occurred in a home within the past 3 years. But many people are uncomfortable living in a murder house, regardless of the time that's passed. Several homes associated with the Golden State Killer have sold at reduced prices or taken longer than average to sell. Some current residents aren't aware of the history. Others know and have made peace with it. Generational memory. For younger residents of these communities, the Golden State Killer is history, something that happened before they were born. But for Gen X and baby boomers who lived through the attacks, it's personal memory. They remember the fear, the community meetings, the news reports. These communities bear invisible scars. They've healed, grown, and moved forward. But the memory of DeAngelo's crimes remains part of their collective identity. Joseph James DeAngelo remains incarcerated at California State Prison, Corcoran. a maximum security facility located in California's Central Valley, about 170 miles north of Los Angeles. He is now 80 years old. Having celebrated his birthday on November 8, 2025, in prison, his health continues to decline. During his court appearances in 2020, he appeared frail, hunched over, and much older than his chronological age. Prison medical records are not public, but observers note that he walks with difficulty and may have cognitive decline. DeAngelo is housed in a protective custody unit, separated from the general prison population. As a former police officer and one of California's most notorious criminals, he would be a high priority target for violence from other inmates if placed in general population. Protective custody means he's isolated, with limited interaction, even with other protective custody inmates. His daily routine is monotonous. He's confined to his cell for approximately 23 hours per day. He has 1 hour of exercise in a small outdoor area. Alone or with 1 or 2 other protective custody inmates, he eats meals in his cell. He has access to limited television programming and can receive mail, though it's unclear if anyone writes to him. He receives no visitors. His 3 daughters had disowned him. His ex-wife, Sharon Huddle, divorced him and has no contact. His siblings have remained publicly silent and apparently have no relationship with him. He has grandchildren, but they want nothing to do with him. DeAngelo has not given any interviews since his arrest. He has not written any letters that have been made public. He has not explained his crimes, expressed genuine remorse beyond his 9-second courtroom statement, or provided any insight into his psychology. He is not engaged in any prison work programs, education, or rehabilitation efforts. At his age and with his health conditions, he's essentially warehoused, waiting to die. California State Prison Corcoran is known for housing high-profile inmates. Other notorious prisoners who've been incarcerated there include Charles Manson, who died there in 2017, Sirhan, Robert F. Kennedy's assassin, and numerous gang leaders. It's a harsh environment, deliberately so. DeAngelo will never be eligible for parole. His sentence is life without possibility of parole, 13 consecutive life sentences. He will die in prison. The only questions are when and from what cause. Given his age and declining health, experts estimate he may have 5 to 10 years remaining. He could die from heart disease, stroke, cancer, or any number of age-related conditions. Prison health care is adequate, but not exceptional. He'll receive treatment for serious medical conditions, but he won't receive the level of care available outside prison. When he dies, it's unclear where he'll be buried. He has no family willing to claim his body. He'll likely be cremated by the California Department of Corrections. His ashes interred in an unmarked prison cemetery or scattered. There will be no headstone, no memorial. Nothing to mark his existence. For victims and survivors, knowledge that DeAngelo is imprisoned provides some comfort. He's suffering in his own way, isolated, elderly, declining, with nothing to look forward to except death. He can't hurt anyone else. He has no freedom, no dignity, no legacy beyond infamy. But some survivors wish he'd receive the death penalty. They feel that life imprisonment is too lenient for someone who destroyed so many lives. Others disagree, believing that execution would end his suffering too quickly, that a long, slow decline in prison isolation is more appropriate. Either way, Joseph James DeAngelo will die behind bars. That much is certain. The legacy he leaves is one of pain, trauma, and eventually, justice delayed but ultimately delivered. Joseph James DeAngelo was never formally evaluated by forensic psychologists for public release. He refused to cooperate with any psychological examination after his arrest. But his behavior across 12 years of crimes and 32 years of dormancy provides a detailed psychological portrait. The most striking aspect of DeAngelo's psychology was his ability to maintain two completely separate identities. By day, he was Joe police officer, husband, father, neighbor. By night, he was a masked predator who raped, tortured, and killed without apparent remorse. This level of compartmentalization is rare even among serial offenders. Most killers show some leakage signs that alert family members or colleagues that something is wrong. DeAngelo showed almost none. His wife Sharon lived with him for 45 years. She shared a bed with him on nights he'd committed rapes, presumably kissed him goodbye on mornings after he'd murdered couples in their sleep. She noticed nothing. How is this possible? Forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who has studied the case, suggests that DeAngelo developed what psychologists call a false self, a carefully constructed persona that he presented to the world while his authentic self remained hidden. The false self was charming enough to marry, competent enough to hold jobs, normal enough to raise children. The authentic self emerged only at night. In ski masks in strangers' homes, this wasn't acting. It was something more complete, a psychological architecture that allowed two selves to coexist without interference. When DeAngelo attended his daughter's school play, he was genuinely present as a father. When he raped a woman hours later, he was genuinely present as a predator. The two selves never merged because they were never allowed to meet. During a July 1978 attack, DeAngelo suddenly began sobbing into his victim's pillow, crying, "I hate you, Bonnie," repeatedly. This moment provides a rare glimpse into his inner psychology. Bonnie Jean Cowell had rejected DeAngelo in 1971, 7 years earlier. She'd ended their engagement and returned his ring. In response, DeAngelo had shown up at her window with a gun, demanding she marry him. She refused. He eventually left. For most people, romantic rejection is painful but survivable. For DeAngelo, Bonnie's rejection appears to have calcified into permanent rage. Every woman he raped became, in some psychological sense, Bonnie. Every assault was punishment for her rejection. This pattern rejection transformed into violent rage against substitute targets is documented in literature on sexually violent offenders. What's unusual about DeAngelo is the duration. 7 years after Bonnie rejected him, he was still crying her name during attacks. The wound never healed because he never allowed it to heal. He kept it fresh, kept it bleeding, used it as fuel. Why did he stop? Perhaps the most puzzling question about Joseph James DeAngelo is why he stopped offending completely after May 1986. Serial rapists and killers rarely stop voluntarily. They're typically caught, imprisoned, incapacitated by illness, or killed. DeAngelo was none of these. He was 40 years old in 1986, not elderly. Still physically capable, he had a job, a home, a family. He faced no apparent legal pressure. Yet after murdering Janelle Cruz, he simply stopped. Several theories exist. Theory 1. Fear of DNA. By the mid-1980s, DNA profiling was emerging as a forensic tool. DeAngelo, with his law enforcement background, may have understood earlier than most criminals that biological evidence would eventually be analyzed. He'd left semen at crime scenes for years. Perhaps he realized that continuing to offend was now scientifically risky. Theory 2. Family responsibilities. DeAngelo's daughters were young in the 1980s born. In 1981, 1983, and 1986. Raising 3 children may have limited his ability to prowl at night without his wife noticing his absences. The practical logistics of being a father of young children may have interrupted his predatory routines. Theory 3. Age and declining drive. Sexual sadists typically experience diminishing compulsions as they age. DeAngelo may simply have aged out his need to assault. Theory 4. He satisfied his needs. DeAngelo had raped at least 51 women and killed 13 people. Perhaps the cumulative effect was satiation. He'd done enough to satisfy whatever dark hunger drove him. The truth may be a combination of all these factors, or something we'll never understand. DeAngelo has never explained his dormancy. He may not fully understand it himself. What's certain is that for 32 years after his final murder, Joseph James DeAngelo functioned as an apparently normal citizen. He worked, retired, became a grandfather. The mask never slipped. The compartments held. Until DNA technology reached across 4 decades and found him anyway. The Golden State Killer case teaches several crucial lessons about criminal justice, forensic science, and societal responses to serial violence. Jurisdictional boundaries are artificial to criminals. DeAngelo exploited the fact that law enforcement agencies operate within defined geographic boundaries, while criminals do not. He attacked in multiple counties, knowing that each maintained separate investigations with minimal coordination. The lesson: multi-jurisdictional task forces and information-sharing systems are essential. Criminals who operate across jurisdictional lines must be met with coordinated responses that transcend those boundaries. Technology eventually catches up. In the 1970s and 1980s, DNA analysis didn't exist. DeAngelo left biological evidence at crime scenes without understanding that technology would eventually be able to identify him from that evidence decades later. The lesson: evidence preservation matters enormously. Cases that seem unsolvable today may be solvable in 10 or 20 years as technology advances. Law enforcement must preserve evidence from cold cases and periodically re-examine them with new forensic tools. Public DNA databases have dual purpose. Millions of people submit DNA to genealogy companies to learn about their ancestry and find relatives. They generally don't consider that this DNA might be used by law enforcement to solve crimes. The lesson: we must balance privacy concerns with legitimate law enforcement needs. Can police use public DNA databases to solve violent crimes? Should genealogy companies notify users that their DNA might be accessed? How do we prevent misuse while allowing beneficial use? These questions don't have easy answers, and society must continue debating them. Rape trauma is lifelong. Many survivors of DeAngelo's attacks lived for 40 years before learning their rapist's identity. During those decades, they struggled with PTSD, hypervigilance, relationship difficulties, and other trauma symptoms. The lesson: sexual assault is not a crime that victims get over. It causes lasting psychological damage. Society must provide better support for survivors, including long-term mental health services, trauma-informed criminal justice processes, and cultural attitudes that validate survivors' experiences rather than dismissing them. Predators can hide in plain sight. DeAngelo was a police officer, husband, father, neighbor. He attended family barbecues and worked alongside colleagues who never suspected him. He looked ordinary. The lesson: we imagine serial killers as obviously disturbed, as people who seem off, but many dangerous offenders are skilled at appearing normal. They hold jobs, raise families, and participate in communities. We must be careful not to dismiss warning signs simply because someone seems normal in other contexts. The badge is not immunity. DeAngelo used his law enforcement training and insider knowledge to commit crimes and avoid detection. The idea that one of their own could be a serial rapist and killer was unthinkable to many of his colleagues. The lesson: law enforcement agencies must be willing to investigate their own members when evidence points to them. The instinct to protect fellow officers must not override the duty to protect public safety. Internal accountability mechanisms are essential. Statute of limitations can deny justice. California's pre-2017 statute of limitations on rape meant DeAngelo couldn't be prosecuted for assaulting 51+ women. Only for murdering 13. Survivors who endured his violence couldn't see him held accountable for those specific crimes. The lesson: violent crimes, particularly sexual assaults, should not have statutes of limitations. If DNA evidence can conclusively identify a perpetrator decades later, prosecution should remain possible. California reformed its laws, but many states have not. Cold cases affect more than victims. Families of murder victims and survivors of violent crimes carry trauma that radiates outward. Children grow up without parents. Spouses never remarry. Siblings feel survivors' guilt. Communities live in fear. The harm extends far beyond the direct victims. The lesson: unsolved violent crimes damage the social fabric. They undermine trust in law enforcement and create lasting community trauma. Solving cold cases isn't just about individual justice, it's about healing communities. Persistence matters. Investigators worked the Golden State Killer case for 44 years. They never gave up. They tried new approaches, embraced new technology, and maintained pressure even when leads went nowhere. The lesson: cold cases can be solved. Persistence, combined with evolving technology and fresh perspectives, can crack cases that seem hopeless. Law enforcement must dedicate resources to cold case investigation and refuse to accept that any violent crime is permanently unsolvable. The Golden State Killer case will be studied for generations as an example of criminal psychology, forensic investigation, and the long arc toward justice. Joseph James DeAngelo terrorized California for 12 years and evaded capture for 32 more. But ultimately, he was caught, prosecuted, and imprisoned for life. Justice was delayed, but it was not denied. Joseph James DeAngelo remains behind bars at California State Prison, Corcoran, serving 13 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Now 80 years old, he will never walk free again. His health continues to decline. He receives no visitors, has no contact with his daughters or ex-wife, and spends 23 hours per day in protective custody isolation. Paul Holes, the investigator who spent 24 years pursuing the case, is now retired and works as a consultant on cold cases and as a television analyst for true crime programs. The survivors who confronted DeAngelo in court continue their healing journeys. Some have become advocates for other sexual assault survivors. Some prefer privacy and anonymity. All carry scars that will never fully heal. But they've reclaimed power that DeAngelo tried to take from them. This is more than a story about a serial rapist and killer. It's a story about how someone can wear a badge while committing monstrous crimes. About how jurisdictional boundaries and technology limitations allowed a predator to operate freely for over a decade. It's a reminder that justice, even when delayed by decades, can still arrive through persistence and evolving science. The 13 people Joseph James DeAngelo murdered: Claude Snelling, Brian and Katie Majari, Charlene and Lyman Smith, Keith and Patrice Harrington, Manuela Within, Sherry Domingo, and Gregory Sanchez, Robert Offerman, and Debra Manning. Janelle Cruz represent lives stolen. Futures erased, families shattered. Their loss diminished us all, and their memory demands that we never stop fighting for justice, no matter how much time passes. If this deep dive has given you a comprehensive understanding of the Golden State Killer case, consider subscribing for more thoroughly researched true crime investigations. What aspect of this case disturbs you most? That DeAngelo was a cop while committing these crimes, or that he lived normally for 32 years afterward? Leave a comment below. We have other deep dives on solved cold cases and forensic breakthroughs. Check them out. Share this with anyone interested in criminal justice, forensic science, or how decades-old cases can finally be solved. And remember, we tell these stories not to glorify violence, but to honor victims, understand how these tragedies happen, and ensure the pursuit of justice never ends. 44 years is a long time to wait for justice. But for 13 families, 51 survivors, and hundreds of terrified communities, that justice finally came.